what surprises me on Vision 2030, it's the role of religion in Islam, which I think they have really done a superb job in readdressing the issue of the role of religion and really the social changes that nobody really believed they would ever happen. The little things and the big things, not just the role of women, but things like driving, things like cinemas, things like restaurants open up, and all of that. That it's a different country. It's a different Saudi Arabia. That surprised me because it's really what makes a country be a country. And Saudi Arabia is definitely a country with a lot of positives and huge prospects. And once they unleashed all these things, the 4% that you quoted as non-oil GDP, with the right reforms, if they continue on the same path, you could easily have double that.
This is the 966.
This is the 966, episode 51. We've got a bit of a modified format this week as we are dealing with multiple different travel schedules and a lot of balls in the air. So this week, we're going to jump right into our really awesome interview with Dr. John Sfakianakis, one of the leading economists on Saudi Arabia and has been for decades. We've known him for a long time. This is a really great discussion, especially if you want to understand the Saudi economy. Dr. John just knows it inside and out. So this week, we're going to be jumping right into that. And then next week, we'll be back with a normal format. And then the following week, we'll be doing a little bit of after action stuff on President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia. So pretty busy few weeks here at the 966. So we apologize for the modified format, but we'll be back with a full show next week. But for now, enjoy our conversation with Dr. John. It's just so good. Today, we'll be talking with our longtime friend and longtime economist and observer of the kingdom, Dr. John Sfakianakis. John has a CV that could fill this whole hour. He is the chief economist and head of research at the Gulf Research Center in Riyadh, professorial fellow at Cambridge, Chatham House, previously served as a chief economic advisor at the Saudi Ministry of Finance. He's held top positions at several banks in the region and the kingdom, including Masic, Ashmore, Banque Saudi Fransi, Credit Agricole, Saudi British Bank, HSBC. Again, we could go on, and is or was recently often quoted in the Financial Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and previously a columnist for Sustig. John, great to see you again. Thanks for joining us on the 966.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Honestly, John, it could go on forever. I think we first met maybe back in 2004, 2005 when you were with Samba. But Lucian understated it. The breadth of your expertise, as an economist, banker, investment, and policy advisor is pretty phenomenal, and we really appreciate you joining us. Thank you. Let's get this started. Yesterday, I participated in a luncheon discussion with Saudi Minister of Investment Khalid Al-Faleh, and I mentioned to him that the Ministry of Investment's first quarter 2022 report was basically 56 pages of just triumph. It was good news on every front, in every sector. I mean, it was an extraordinary first quarter for Saudi Arabia. And in fact, the GDP grew 9.9%, the fastest in a decade. On an annualized basis, this would put GDP growth somewhere around 10%, which would be more than twice the 4.5% annual GDP growth projected for the G20 as a group. So the Saudi economy is on quite a roll. Can you share your thoughts on how it got there and where it might be headed?
No, thank you. So I believe that, the economy is doing quite well, especially over the last several months, because oil prices have gone up for some time and they have stayed up. So no surprise that the performance of the economy is doing well, but also because of the non-oil segment, not just because of oil money going into the economy, but also because of the investments that the government is making. And within the government, I would say the PIF is making in helping incentivize opportunities, create alternatives to the oil economy. There is something more than just oil that's helping. But of course, we need to be fair in giving an answer to your question that the oil story is a big part of what is happening to the economy. I mean, during the pandemic, Saudi Arabia did well, not because oil prices went down. In fact, they went down and they could have done pretty badly. And if you look at the performance of the economy, it did quite well. But that's because there was a lot of demand that was created within Saudi Arabia. And that demand was kept within the borders, one, because people couldn't go. So suddenly a lot of that money that would have leaked due to tourist visits outside ended up inside the economy. Saudis discovered Saudi Arabia once again, and domestic demand was supported as a result of these moves. So overall, one needs to be fair. Now, a lot of these investments that both the PF and the government at large is making have a long-term effect. So it will be incorrect of me to say also that, well, the economy has diversified. Here we are. No, the economy is trying to diversify, hasn't diversified. And I think that it's difficult to say when it will complete the diversification effort, because we know quite well that in the world, we haven't yet seen an example of an oil economy with such huge dependence like Saudi Arabia go from dependence to no dependence. And I think Saudi Arabia will always have a certain amount of dependence on oil as long as the world will want to have oil. And of course, there is a different kind of debate going on whilst we're speaking, and for some time now, especially during the beginnings of the Ukraine crisis and war, we have been hearing a lot about the green recovery, the green revolution, the separation between dictators, despots, and democracies, and so forth. And I think that also has to be taken into account, because the world could be changing much faster than one, Saudi Arabia anticipated, and two, Saudi Arabia desires. Because Saudi Arabia could change, but it might not change fast enough with what the world is doing. And that's the biggest challenge. And I've said that for many years. Yes, it's good to reform. And what Saudi Arabia has done over the last 6 years are possibly monumental for any economy within the emerging markets, for sure. But if we were to place them within OECD, and I would say even G20, or even within the BRICS, many of these reforms that Saudi Arabia has done in 6 years, many of these countries haven't done in 30, 40 years. So one needs to recognize the efforts, but Saudi Arabia can change. The question is, what does the rest of the world do? And I think this is a difficult question to answer right now.
You raised two questions there. You're exactly right. The top line number is oil based. During that first quarter, non-oil activity rose close to 4%, and that's all good. Non-oil activity in general is raising, but it's still driven by oil. This is a question I have, and you suggest there's really not a roadmap for Saudi Arabia, because nobody has done this in terms of a country that is this dependent on oil trying to diversify. Is that accurate?
I think even if you go to the central bank of reforms, which is, let's say, the Washington consensus, to coin it in an academic way, but also to maybe use it within the terminology of the neoliberal economists, which is the international financial institutions. So basically the World Bank and the IMF, if you go to both of them and ask them the same question, and you ask them, please tell us, what is the roadmap? Show us the encyclopedia of diversification. They will tell you, we have no idea, because they haven't done it as well, nor should they be saying to anybody how to do it. They kind of have a roadmap. They kind of know the road, and they think they know, and while they're going at it, they try to fix it. And I think this is a fair point to be made. I don't think in 2015 anybody would have envisioned that in the pandemic would arrive in 2019, 2020. And then right after the pandemic, you would have a war that will, destroy the fabric of Europe's World War II reconstruction era, and you would have a new, reconstructed NATO, and then you would have embargo and oil prices rising to these levels, which are beginning to hurt the global economy. And at the same time, you would have concerns about global recession, trade wars, isolation, supply shocks, post-COVID recovery. We've gone through a lot. So I don't think anybody has the roadmap. I think Saudi Arabia has done exceptionally well, but also they made plenty of mistakes. And within the two, you need to vacillate and find where the best option is. The only thing that Saudi Arabia can do, and I say this because there are other countries that could benefit from Saudi Arabia's example. I would say the big lesson learned is that you need to have political commitment. So this can work in certain structures. I don't think the economic reforms that Saudi Arabia has witnessed can work at all in a pluralistic environment, because you need to have the commitment from the top, and the top needs to approach it in a very structural, hierarchical way. And also, Saudi Arabia was never meant to be a democracy. It is a monarchy, but it was a very difficult monarchy to manage in the 21st century with all the problems it had, the challenges. And I would say primarily they're economic. Others will say they're social, they're political, they're regional, they're geopolitical. Yes, but I would say that mainly a voter votes on the basis, put it this way, of their pocket, not really because of their foreign policy. So in the US, presidents come and go because of the power of the purse, not because of, what's the US president's foreign policy with China. That's a secondary issue. And I think the same way every other country functions. So Saudi Arabia is no exception. I think what will make or break Saudi Arabia, and I think they are on the right path, is clearly the economic reforms. And these are very important to get them right. Now, the IMF or every IMF around the world doesn't have the magic answers, nor do economists. And what the leadership has to learn, and I think they have learned it, is to be nimble. But again, it's not easy. It's not easy. It's easier to do such reforms in a smaller, let's say, city-state, rather than a country the size of Saudi Arabia, the geography, the people. Now you're talking about 35 million people. Now, can you do the same in a country like Egypt? Well, Egypt is nearly 110 million people. It's not easy. And you have the vestiges of the past. Remember, Saudi Arabia has a very big state. The presence of the state in the economy is substantial. And you need to break that, and you need to remodel it, restructure it with new people. And you need to do civil service reform. And that's not easy. How do you do this? And the wage bill in Saudi Arabia is extraordinarily high for an OECD country or a G20 country. 50% of the budget goes towards wages. And of course, the challenge is when oil prices go down, and it's not an if, it's when, right? Let's not also be darlings to oil dependency on the demand side. I think oil prices will at some point correct, and they will correct whether violently or gradually. Again, the same challenge will be there. What will you do with the residual? What will you do with your wage bill? That's a concern for Saudi Arabia, but it is a concern for other countries as well. Kuwait has a similar problem, and so forth. So all I'm saying is that here I think Saudi Arabia needs to be acknowledged for the work it has done given the difficult region, given the unpredictability of oil prices, Now you might ask, but John, what if they didn't do the reforms? Would Saudi Arabia been better off without the reforms or not? And I think my answer is very clear. I think Saudi Arabia would not have been better off by waiting for oil prices to recover, which was the old type of Saudi Arabia. We wait for a recovery to happen. We go back to status quo ante. Everything is fine. We don't hire. We don't do capex. We don't do investments. Gross fixed capital investments remain low. We accumulate debt. We don't pay the residuals and the overheads, and our people, our contractors, they go out of business. We don't really care. Private sector goes into a recession. Nothing happens. Everybody stays in the state and in the public sector. Private sector, either fires the expats or doesn't have any Saudi. So that's the old model, and that I think has been broken. You have a very different Saudi Arabia today. If you look at just the labor reforms that were applied, I mean, they were revolutionary without having a revolution, right? I mean, they were fantastic in bringing in female talent. Now they need to get that talent to be productive. It's not productive enough. Productivity in Saudi Arabia remains quite low. That needs to be addressed. If they don't improve productivity, Saudi Arabia will not be able to reach its 2030 goals. And mathematically, it is impossible. So they need to fix. And I think the leadership knows that. But also you need to remember that there are capacity restraints. You cannot do everything, in a short period of time. And time goes very fast when you are at the very top. When you are both a minister or a crown prince or a king, time flies. And there are many events that happen while you're changing your country. I mean, who would have thought that you would have now a war going on in Europe? The peaceful, Europeans discovered that they're not so peaceful. And suddenly you have the Swedes and the Finns joining NATO. Who would have thought that Sweden and Finland would do that? And who would have thought that the EU would be expanding eastward? And they would, the Ukrainians and Moldova will be joining soon the EU. I mean, nobody would have thought that Germany would go out and buy $100 billion or 100 billion euros worth of arms from the US in a matter of 5 days, right after the Russians invaded Ukraine. Who would have thought that you would have a supply crunch on major items? Who would have thought that now we're fighting stagflation? Global inflationary pressures are huge. Plus, we have, the difficulties of what seems to be a substantial headwind, which is a recession. Whether it's an L shape or a V, I think I'm tilting more towards a deep recession, which it's going to be unavoidable, because remember, guys, the world has done quite well for 12 years. I mean, stock markets have done exceptionally well around the world, especially in the US. People made a lot of money. You had asset bubbles throughout. People in social media started advertising on cars. Every car under the sun went up. Now we have a shortage in manufacturing enough chips to make the cars. So things are quite hazy globally. And then we were told that, we don't have all kinds of inputs to produce goods, whether industrial or otherwise. So I think, Saudi Arabia, given the turmoil, it found itself, not because of its own doing, because the world became really radicalized with all the things that nobody was expecting, has done pretty well. And of course, the oil price, going back to your original question, has helped quite a bit. Making roughly $1 to $1.2 billion every day from the sale of oil on a continuous basis is pretty good news. The question is if that oil money is well used. And I think the answer to that is, I think, much more today. And I think Saudi Arabia is making some blunt and obvious bets. And it has to make these bets because it is time to make these bets. Bets with itself, with its people, with its society, and with the world. and he needs to test its capacity. Whether it says in public that they made mistakes, that's I think, a secondary issue. But the primary issue is that they learn. Of course, the longevity of the high oil price has to be there to sustain some of these bets, because obviously if oil goes to 50 and 40, the sustainability of many of the projects, or at least the funding of some of the multiple things that are being done, will be much more challenged. Of course, having said all this, I'll go to the corollary, which is that, Saudi Arabia still has excessively, I would say, low debt to GDP, because in times like these, debt is not going to matter for anybody. We've seen that, everybody is going to issue so much debt to get out of this mess. Whether they call it green revolution or something else, they'll have to do something with capital expenditures to kickstart these economies. Obviously, it's not going to happen next year, because I think next year we're going to be facing bad news because of unemployment in the advanced economies. And now it's just the bad news because of equities and asset prices collapsing. And then it's going to be housing. And then you're going to see corporates hiring less, and then corporates firing more. And that is going to take us right into 24, 25. But then the recovery, which will happen eventually, has to happen because of issuance of debt. So Saudi Arabia is better off. What Saudi Arabia needs to do is that they make the dividends come from these bets, right? Whether it's the tourism dividend, whether it's the entertainment, whether it's the domestic economic, localization, whether it's, all the other things that they're trying to do, whether it's the NEOM, the technology, it's the right time for Saudi Arabia to be making these bets, because it needs to have a fair approach and needs to take matters in its own hands.
There's so much to unwrap there, but let me take you back to Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia. So you state, and I think we agree 100%, that the plan, Vision 2030, was required. It was necessary. The current trajectory in 2014 and was not sustainable. You, if I understand you correctly, you believe that there is leadership and discipline sufficient to execute this plan. But you put your finger on something that we hear a lot on the 966, and that is capacity. And as an economist, how does so as you say, Saudi Arabia is trying to do a lot of things at once. Nothing is in trying to thread them all together and hit a target and have these things come together in the right way. Underpinning all of this is capacity in many ways. I mean, how does Saudi Arabia catch up in that regard? Can Saudi Arabia catch up in that regard?
Yeah, so I'm an optimist by nature, so I think that Saudi Arabia can catch up. I think that they have talent. They just need to have more experience. And I would urge for the experience to be not localized. It needs to be externalized. So Saudis need to stop returning to Saudi. They need to also go outside and get experience. And they need to stay outside for long periods of time. And this is not a recipe for everybody to do that, but you need to have that as also a policy-driven part, and that is something that is done. So it is a directive, let's say, that they need to occupy senior positions in corporates, international corporates. They learn the ropes and they return back to their country. And this is something that we've seen successful countries doing. Why? Because it is very difficult, guys. Let me say it differently. It's not as easy as people think to put knowledge into brains, but it is also very difficult to move brains. So it is, we know how long it takes for somebody to earn a PhD. Now, I'm not saying that a PhD is anything but somebody who has been told what to write, because his supervisors will accept or reject what he writes, and he goes through many processes of doing that. But let's say a medical doctor goes through many levels of education and learning. The medical doctors really get all their training when they start practicing, and you practice as a doctor, and you learn the most when you are in a big place. So if you are in a top medical school, hospital, somewhere around the world, and you live and work there for 10 years, imagine how much knowledge you bring back to your country when you return. That is something that none of the Gulf states are doing. Everybody wants to return back. And that's a fault of the rent-seeking economy. This is the vestige of the past, which needs to be addressed, right? This is something that is structural. Everybody wants to return back because it is easy to find, or easier to find, jobs that pay more in your home country, let's assume, because it is a rent-seeking structure rather than really competing outside with the best, right? So this is where you add value to your country. So I think that, and some countries do it purposely. There are policies towards that. Many countries do it. And I will not go very far. I mean, look at the talent that, for instance, in a specific sector, I would use the food sector, the retail food wholesale sector that many Egyptians have in the global marketplace. Look at the Indians and other ethnicities that occupy top tier Fortune 500 companies. So, capacity is built that way. That's only part of the solution, right? By bringing back the talent once you send it outside. But secondly, it takes time. And I'm optimistic that, the talent that is back home will be able to learn. Of course, they'll need to learn and learn from their own mistakes. And I think that is where we are today in Saudi Arabia. So I think that you need still capacity to unleash itself. It takes time. It's not good enough to have 2 years experience. I mean, it's good to rely on gray-haired advisors, not including myself. But let me use an example from the yacht world. Yachting is a sport that requires experience. You cannot acquire it within 2 or 3 years. You cannot hire a management consultant to do the work for you and give you a PowerPoint and tell you how to say what. Yachting comes as an experienced sport after many years of turmoil in the sea. So, there is no quick way of fixing it. But I'm very optimistic that, Saudis will learn the ropes. And the more mistakes they make, and they need to be confident about the mistakes they make, because they make plenty of them, like every other country. They need to be proud of their mistakes and move on and learn from them.
You mentioned there is no roadmap for a rentier state like Saudi Arabia of its size to diversify like it's trying to do. Another institution in Saudi Arabia that seems to be without precedent is the Public Investment Fund. This is not like any sovereign wealth fund that I'm familiar with. Is that a fair characterization? Are they doing things that are unique?
I think within the time frame given and the ambitions provided, yes, I think they're very unique. And they're very unique in ramping up very quickly. They're very unique in trying to build capacity. They're very unique in trying to do the internal development of the country, internal domestic investments, as well as investing outside. I think it is an amazing institution for a sovereign fund that basically pre-2015 was nearly moribund.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was founded in 1971, so I'm as old as the PIF. So the PIF was moribund for 44, 45 years of its existence. Over the last 5 to 6 years, it has done everything imaginable that a sovereign fund can do. And it's not easy, having said that, because I think we need to be fair with one comment here. Saudi Arabia has no time, guys. Saudi Arabia should have done all these things 15 years ago, perhaps 20 years ago, and it's easier said than done. Oh, John, how could we have done this? And why? Well, there were different times that, in any case, it's the past. But Saudi Arabia has no time, and it has no time because of things that we're going through today. The world is advancing very quickly. Yes, there are issues that I have. There are many, problems that I see with the green recovery globally and how fast we go into this, transition green economy. I'm not so sure. I think before we decarbonize, we're going to carbonize quite heavily. The world hasn't understood that, just because we operate Teslas, that's clean energy. Well, how do you produce the electricity for a Tesla car? Well,
cool.
that's that the consumer doesn't ask that question. I think that's a problem, right? Yeah, the rare minerals, the rare earth minerals, and the whole debate about ESG and what is ESG. And, I think the world is involved in a lot of greenwashing at the same time. And there's huge things with that. But, Saudi Arabia has no time to wait for it to be dictated how it needs to look like and adapt. So I think, I would say all of the things they have done, even the mistakes they have done, outweigh, the mistakes with the good, because they just don't have the time. Did they need to engage with 55 to 60% of your population being educated and sitting idle at home, doing nothing? And they needed to be engaged. Okay, is it great? Are they productive? No, they need to address this. Are at the same time also productivity issues a problem? Yes, they are. They need to be addressed. Do I prefer this leadership than the previous leadership to address these issues? No, I prefer any day this leadership, because I know that the leadership under, they're fighting against time, because what they're doing is as a result of the benefits they're getting from oil. They cannot privatize the entire Aramco operation. One, that wouldn't be takers, because they'll start asking questions. Why are you privatizing the whole thing? Are you leaving? So I don't think we're going to get to that. And also, at some point, hydrocarbons are going to shift out. Yeah, of course, will it happen in 2030, 40, 50, 60? No, but do you prefer a leadership asking questions? What happens in the post-oil era? Yes, I do, because before we didn't want to ask that. Now, did we need to do energy reforms? Yes, of course. With energy reforms, if you look at gasoline consumption, it has gone down. So the country has become more efficient. Now, of course, those who are stuck with big cars, have to buy smaller cars. Yeah, okay, that's a reality. And those who have big homes and used to have ACs running all day, well, they have to buy more efficient ACs, and Saudi Arabia needs to build smaller homes. So there are certain realities, and I think that the structures of these realities, where gradually Saudi Arabia is moving out of the rent-seeking model. The rent-seeking model of Saudi Arabia of 2005, or when I first came to Saudi Arabia. My first visit was in 2001, and then I permanently moved there in 2003. Was the old traditional rent-seeking model. Government makes oil money, hires people in the state. Private sector is kind of competitive with elements of oligopoly and monopoly, and beneficiaries of the government largesse. And if the government had money, private sector did well, and everything else kind of stayed the same for 60 years. And then suddenly you have a shock in the economy. So do I want that? I mean, that gives Saudi Arabia a future. The old system does not give Saudi Arabia a future. It gives it a future as long as the outside wants to give it a future, meaning as long as they want the oil and as long as they want them to be included in the geoeconomic map. And we know very well geoeconomic maps change every day. Who would have thought that, we would have in the midst of all this Europe up in arms against the Russians, and the Russians threatening now not to provide any natural gas to the Europeans during the winter months. I mean, I don't know what the Europeans will do. They should all migrate to Mexico, probably.
We talk a lot on the show on how pivotal King Salman is for this very reason, recognizing that recognizing time is running out. As you say, Saudi Arabia has no time, and understanding that change had to happen now, and you had to put somebody in charge who was going to, if he has to, bulldoze that change and push it forward. So it's fascinating to hear you give context to that, John. What aspect of Vision 2030 and the diversification efforts has surprised you most? I mean, for example, tourism initiatives. I mean, they've been taken up quite quickly, and there seems to be, obviously, largely domestic, but the numbers are really impressive. I mean, entertainment, or is there something else that you have found kind of stunning and surprising?
So tourism, Saudi Arabia is making a bet, and we will see what happens. And why should they not make a bet? They have the sea, they have the land, they have the archaeology. People do not know about it, and they're discovering more and more. The issue is that they live in a competitive environment. So, Egypt is competing, Jordan is competing. Do they have the same capital force as some of the other countries? Probably not, but they are competing. It's a difficult area to compete. But again, they have certain elements that once the world starts discovering, which is, the Red Sea and all of that, and there you might need some tweaking. Maybe there isn't so much need for 7-star services. You might need for less. I think that could be tweaked. I mean, again, market forces have this amazing ability to tell a story, and I think the story will be told. Saudi Arabia is competing with the likes of Dubai and everybody else, but it's about time for Saudi Arabia to be opening up because it has a lot of offerings. Now, entertainment, I think, it will be, mainly a local consumption story. And why should they go to Dubai and Bahrain? They used to go to Bahrain to watch a movie, just stay in Saudi. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the biggest element in all this, and I'll be very blunt, as I'm always, tourists will go if there is some kind of encouragement from the beverage side. Mm-hmm. So if there are beverages, maybe things will be even more enticing, but that's something for the leadership to decide, not for me.
Is there anything in the Vision 2030 that an aspect that you think is particularly overlooked? And I will offer one. I've been impressed with the fiscal discipline. I mean, they had this first quarter they had a $15 billion surplus, and that they seem to be avoiding this boom bust cycle that you talk about. And that to me has been really not only required and necessary, but impressive, because they seem to be very committed to trying to break that boom bust cycle and to stay with their targets. So, for example, I think the 2023 budget is spending is projected to be less than this year, and they're sticking with it.
Yeah, I think in certain ways it has been exemplary and exceptionally good. Having said this, I think the liquidity situation had to be addressed recently in order to help the bank. So I think maybe they went a little bit too far, right? So and the writings were there for quite a few months now. So yes, I think the discipline is there. So what you described, the boom bust cycle. So the typical structure of high oil revenues, high spending. Well, a lot of the spending is coming out of the PIF. So it is more segmented and it is more focused. It's not what it used to be, but there is still spending going on in many of these mega projects. But you did say one important thing, that there is discipline. There isn't just crazy spending and undisciplined capex here and there, because that the question is being asked internally. What happens when there is a sudden correction in oil prices, and they could happen very quickly, guys, in the coming months. I think we haven't seen it because we're still in this aftershock of the Ukraine war. Once we get hit with the main issue, which is the recession that the global economy is facing, they will begin to look at oil prices, meaning that consumption will decline, not just for oil, but for all. We're seeing that trade figures are beginning to fall, especially in Asia. If we have a substantial correction in Asia, we're seeing that port deliveries for the major ports in both Shanghai and in Singapore and in South Korea is on the decline. We know very well that trade between Asia and the rest of the world is on the decline. Saudi Arabia's oil is exported mainly in Asia. So the price of oil in Asia is going to decline, which means that the price of oil is going to decline in the coming months. So they're basically quite aware that the storm is coming. They just haven't announced it, right? Nor should they. But I think they're pretty vigilant and very careful in applying discipline on the fiscal side, because 2023, unless we go into more war, and unless central banks try to find quick solutions, which I don't think they will, it will be difficult to avoid a major recession. Now, whether again it's an L or a W or a V, I don't think it's going to be a V, quick recovery. This is going to be more a drawn out recovery. It's going to take a while for us to recover. Not a huge while, but it will take several, good months. It will be 12 to 18 months or possibly 2 years, which means that oil prices will have to reflect that. You cannot have a global recession and oil is going to be at $120 a barrel. So oil is going to substantially correct. So they're forecasting for that correction and taking measures. What do you do with a budget if oil is at 50 and 60? And there you have to take measures of what capex you do and how do you address your wage bill. I mean, it is pretty even keel on with oil at 60, but if oil takes we go into a deep dive of a deep depression or recession, and let's assume, I don't expect this to be the case, but oil at 20, then you have significant deficits and you need to issue debt and so forth. So I think they're being very fiscally correct and extremely prudent. And I think they're teaching a lot of other Gulf nations a big lesson, especially the ones that are seemingly not able to decide very quickly on how to manage their economies. And I won't name them, but people who know the region understand them. But Saudi Arabia, besides that, has offered the Gulf a lot of optimism as to how to recover. But let me also answer your question, which is very important, Richard. The question about what surprised me with Vision 2030. It's not just a fiscal, it is really the social, and it is really the role of religion that has surprised me the most. And I know this is something that an economist shouldn't say, or how can he opine on some of these things, because it's not my domain. But because I have lived for 18 years in Saudi Arabia, and I consider it my own home country. Although I think they talk about golden visas and passports, I think I will never get one, even if in other countries probably I would have received 4 passports of the same country during the same time. I think that is something that Saudi Arabia should address as well, because that's the only way you can attract talent. So you don't just bring your own talent, but that you bring talent by making people included and feel inclusive. And I think that is a challenge for Saudi Arabia and for society. It is not yet inclusive. So that I need to say as a footnote. But what surprises me on Vision 2030, it's the role of religion and Islam, which I think they have really done a superb job in readdressing the issue of the role of religion, and really the social changes that nobody really believed they would ever happen. The little things and the big things, not just the role of women, but things like driving, things like cinemas, things like restaurants open up, and all of that. That it's a different country. It's a different Saudi Arabia. That surprised me, because it's really what makes a country be a country. And Saudi Arabia is definitely a country with a lot of positives and huge prospects. And once they unleashed all these things, the 4% that you quoted as non-oil GDP, with the right reforms, if they continue on the same path, you could easily have double that. So 8% non-oil GDP, or private GDP, let's put it that way, creates enough jobs, because you need about 6.5% private sector growth to hire for all the Saudis who are joining your labor force every year. You need it sustainably done over periods of time. And you need to do it in a way that is both inclusive, but also enough for you to create the wealth. Because, eventually Saudi Arabia needs to find for the wealth the replaced wealth that is not going to come from oil in the coming 20, 30 years, because you still produce oil, export, roughly 6 to 7 million barrels. You're not going to export 10. You will export roughly the same amount. Maybe you will export less. Price will go down for sure, right? So I'm going to stay at 120. So you will have less of that wealth. Then you need to replace it with something else. So as long as that something else is done within the country, be it in services, be it with Saudis being engaged. Now, of course, the next, I think, 5 years should be all about productivity. Again, I think I mentioned it 4 times. It is the only thing that makes Saudi Arabia look quite awkward against all indices. Regardless what everybody will say, that is something that is punitive on Saudi Arabia's potential. And if aspirationally Saudi Arabia wants to be an economy larger than that of Mexico by 2030, which is what Vision 2030 says, it's not going to be done because of the price of oil, because this year will be the year that Saudi Arabia will have the greatest benefits from the oil story. It will probably hit somewhere around $1 trillion, but they're going from 1 to 1.5, where Mexico is going to be a very tough order, a very tall order. And the only way to do it, we have seen it throughout, 300 years of economic history. This is only done through productivity changes. So unless it becomes more productive, Saudi Arabia will not be able to increase its per capita income in sustainable terms over the next few decades.
John, this is like going to class. Lucian, did you want to add or jump in or edit?
When John speaks, Lucian listens. And that's been my policy since I met John in 2009. So and I'm sticking with it. So this has been fantastic, John. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
No, thank you. I just, I think Saudi Arabia gets a lot of criticism for being Saudi Arabia. I would say to Saudi Arabia that you just need to keep pushing with what you're doing. Because one, countries don't have friends, like people don't have a lot of friends. Secondly, everybody nowadays is up against themselves and the world. Things have changed quite dramatically, especially as a result of COVID and post-COVID. And thirdly, I think that I'm very happy to see that within my world of countries I observe, or some of my other economist colleagues observe, Saudi Arabia really has done a lot to change. And it takes a lot. I mean, it really takes political will and commitment to keep on pushing. Even with the mistakes, even with, the 2016 was a difficult year, 2017 was even more difficult, 2018 was a better year for Saudi Arabia. I'm just going back just to relate and give context to people. And then came COVID. I mean, who would have imagined that, we would be locked up? And Saudis were really locked up in their country, right? But that was to the benefit of the country because entertainment was discovered, domestic tourism was discovered. Saudis went to Alula and discovered Alula. They discovered other parts of beautiful Saudi Arabia. And as a result of that, Saudi Arabia got traction, but also it got demand satisfaction. People got to know and understand. I know a lot of Saudis love to go to the south of France. That's great. But the French are benefiting, not the Saudis. Mm-hmm. And I think the more you get Saudis, the French, by the way, just to use this example, don't travel a lot outside of France. So there is a lot of domestic tourism. And so Saudi Arabia has discovered that. I'm very happy. And it has wonderful destinations. The fact that they're building in a friendly, ecological way, the Red Sea coast is very important. The fact that they're thinking of, adding all these trees, 10 million trees in Riyadh, that's also great. So I think there is a rediscovery of Saudi Arabia. But as I said, nobody can tell, take the blueprint of, Malaysia and apply it to Saudi Arabia. Malaysia made some catastrophic mistakes at certain points in time. The Malaysians didn't like to say, but they're not the example, the model. The Mexicans benefited greatly from the diversification, the industrial diversification of the U.S. They went into Mexico because of cheap labor. Mexico started diversifying away from oil. Still, oil is important for the Mexican economy, but Saudi Arabia is not Mexico. And I say to people that, even if you try to look at best cases and best practice, John, tell us, what's the best practice? Management consultants always like to ask you two questions. The low-hanging fruit, what's the low-hanging fruit? And secondly, best practice. As if, the best practice of Angola is going to be applied in the Middle East. I had a professor of mine, he was my PhD supervisor, and he always made fun of people trying to compare certain countries with other countries. So the Egyptians in the 1990s loved to compare themselves to the Koreans, but only back to the 1950s because the GDP of Egypt was bigger than Korea, right? But he would often say that, how can you even start to compare yourselves, Egyptians, with the Koreans? I mean, you're completely different, right? So I don't think that, we need to be very careful from taking all these examples of the literature and examples of economic progress and reform and apply it. I think there is a certain sense of Saudiness that has to come into the well-being. Will Saudi Arabia be able to localize its military industries aspirationally by 2030 by the amount announced? No, it won't. I mean, as much as one can want, it will not happen because there are certain facts that it does not permit, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for any country to become 50% self-sufficient. Yeah, Israel can do it, but Israel is a very different case. In fact, Israel is nearly self-sufficient in everything on the military side, but that's because of the specificity of the country.
And they didn't do it in a decade.
No, absolutely. I mean, the case of the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Turks, the Brazilians in the military industry, which I know quite a bit of, have done it, as you said, Richard, for 40, 50 years with many pitfalls and mistakes. The Indians tried, they failed. The Brazilians, half of the industry failed, some of them survived. Embraer survived, some of the ammunitions and small weapons survived, everything else failed and crashed and burned. The Turks have been somehow successful, but only recently, but not in the global market so much as the domestic market. There are many case studies. So I think it's good to have these aspirations. Probably, it will take them far more than 10 years. And again, the plan is as good as the advice you're given. And the advice given back then was probably not correct. But aspirationally, it's fine to be pushing the envelope, going back to the initial element that it's good to press your people because you don't have time. Saudi Arabia has no time. And I think this is the most important element of Vision 2030, that and also if you turn it around, it also tells you the story of what was Saudi Arabia and how much it had to change to come up with the totality of reforms that is Vision 2030, because it's not just an economic plan, it's a social economic reform plan that addresses issues of lifestyle, sports, health, not just privatization and GDP and fiscal sustainability and all of that, but it's the totality and the role of religion and how do we manage that? So I think that also Saudi Arabia, wearing its hat of being a leader within the Islamic Muslim world, being the custodian of the holy mosques, has a huge burden on itself to continue to do that. And I was very happy to see a more moderate Saudi Arabia on the religious front. And that required a lot of political will. Nobody else wanted to, crack the egg. Mm-hmm. Everybody said, how difficult it was. What kind of Saudi Arabia was that? But, well, amazingly, Saudi Arabia has done the unthinkable. And I think a lot of people are very grateful of that Saudi Arabia, of this Saudi Arabia, the more moderate Islamic Saudi Arabia.
John, I think we should end there, but I want to, you synopsize really a lot of what the 966 is doing, because you just outlined fundamental changes that are ongoing and processes that are underway, transitions that have begun, that are deep and profound and consequential, and are essential to Saudi Arabia getting to where it wants to go. And it's not necessarily, as you say, going to get there in the timeline that's laid out. But we really try and bring some focus to how deep and meaningful these changes are. Because as you know, most people look at Saudi Arabia and you say they criticize Saudi because it's Saudi. Even some might have heard of Vision 2030, but when you dig down deep into it and how just profound and systemic the changes are, and how difficult they are to achieve, and how aspirational they are, and even trying to achieve them, you get a better understanding of the challenge ahead, and you get a better understanding of what's been accomplished. And I think you just in listening to you this past hour, I think you really run the field really nicely in helping people sort of understand all that's involved.
Yeah, let me say something about this, Richard. I'm very glad you mentioned these things because people, let's take great leaders, statesmen, if there are any nowadays, and bring them over to Saudi Arabia to rule the old Saudi Arabia and to understand the challenges that Saudi Arabia had and make them change the environment that they were in. Saudi Arabia was not a level playing field. Saudi Arabia was a country that had a lot of leakage. It didn't, go with the best practice. It knew it had challenges, but it didn't want to reform. It had fiscal, issues to address. There was a substantial amount of lack of transparency. Governance was a huge concern, and that made Saudi Arabia look difficult. Now look at what has been done. Today there is a level playing field. There are strict governance rules. Corruption has been lowered. I'm not saying eradicated. There is no, eradication of corruption even in advanced economies, all of that, or other countries, right? There is always petty corruption and whatnot. But, Saudi Arabia had to start. So you needed to bring in you needed somebody to make the country livable, sustainable. It basically today's leadership gave Saudi Arabia a lifeline, in all honesty. Because let's say, we did nothing from 2015 to 2021. Suddenly we arrive in 2021 and oil goes up 120. Great, we make $1 million. Okay, we'll have a surplus and everybody goes fine. What do? We spend all the money, same stuff. And then what is the future for our for our 20, 30-year-olds? Well, they're not working. Our women are sitting at home. And we still have the same kind of leakages, remittances, expat population. We have a bloated private sector, public sector. We haven't privatized anything. We have lousy infrastructure in terms of, demands on the state to invest, and we don't do anything about privatizing infrastructure, airports, healthcare, education. We have huge universities producing people, but they're not going anywhere. And they're all getting employed in the public sector. And by the way, some of it is still there today. People do have a preference to work for the public sector. Private sector is still tough. That will change, but Saudi Arabia gave itself a lifeline. But I would say and hope that it is more than a lifeline. It's taken, as I said before, its own life. It has taken its future in its own hand, and that's very important because they deserve that and they own that. They just need to act very quickly. Now, with stereotypes, what can you do? The world will have to live with them. But I think I would definitely, and I believe, take this leadership, what I see today in its totality, than what I used to see before. If I was to make a bet, I would prefer to make my bet with this, what I see today, leadership, than with the old leadership. Because in times like this, you wouldn't have a fiscal surplus. You wouldn't have the residual. You would have a private investment fund that hardly makes an investment outside. Pre 2015, they made one investment, which was in a Korean construction company. Today, they are multiple investments. Look, some of them are bound to go bad, really bad, right? I'm not saying that they're brilliant stars, everybody, and if they were, they would be teaching other people how to do it. But in the world of investments, it's all about making enough wins to minimize your losses. And as long as you have more wins than losses, your investment thesis is making sense. The difficulty about Saudi Arabia, and I would end with this, is that not only do they need to have dividends to sustain themselves, because of the missing gap that will come as a result of the declining oil wealth, and that's investments outside that the PF has to make. It has to be bold. It has to also, time it, and obviously you don't always time it well. But secondly, you need to develop the country. And you have a private sector that has been long sitting, benefiting from the rent-seeking structure of the economy. So the private sector is ambivalent. It was shaken, no doubt, in 2017, in November 2017. A level playing field has been set. So now the rules are for everybody the same, and it's beginning to engage. But back then, the PF had to act as the seed developer, not just the seed capital, but the seed developer for many of these things, because you had a private sector that was ambivalent, it wasn't sure, you had a difficult private sector to deal with, and it's still, I would say difficult, because it is trying to restructure itself. So you do have parallel economies, right? What the PF is trying to do ab initio is exemplary, or what NEOM is trying to do is exemplary, because it is trying to think about a territory, a land that will be very evolutionary, but at the same time revolutionary in terms of the landscape, in terms of the offerings, in terms of the investments. What Saudi Arabia, I think, my humble advice is needs to keep on doing is speaking from the heart and telling people the story that they're building. And it is, I think, a great story. And people will come in. People will invest in what is being built. I am very convinced. But it needs to come from the heart with a conviction and commitment, not just the numbers. The 52 pages that you quoted at the beginning, Richard. Real investors don't have time to look at 52 pages. They will look at 3 or 4 things. They will look, one, for political stability. Number 2, stability of the currency. Number 3, the region. Number 4, pricing. And if I may say so, incentives. Human capital is important, so capacity is important, but that can be addressed with automation. Industry today is getting into full automation, not even near automation, right? So it is really these 5 or 6 things that investors are looking for. If you talk from the heart, people will listen to you. When you color it too much and provide a lot of cosmetics, people run away because they see through you. And I think Saudi Arabia is speaking from the heart. It needs to continue doing that. And I think some of the key investments of the PIF are really gems. I'm very optimistic, especially about some of the things that they're doing, like NEOM, like the tourism offerings, the tourism and archaeology, the entertainment, and then, of course, the rebuilding of Riyadh. Really, this is the state getting involved, and doing the best. And hopefully, the lesson learned here is that over time, the state needs to be crowding out itself and crowding in the private sector, because then the local private sector comes in, because as the private sector comes in, and I think we do have elements of that happening, you will get the international private sector coming in. And that is very important for a sustainable economic story for the next 20 years for Saudi Arabia.
Few people inside or outside of the kingdom understand it as well as you. Dr. John Sfakianakis, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you soon. And thank you so much for your insights for our listeners and viewers.
Thank you.